It's no secret that writing can be lonely work, but does it really have to be? Whether you're full-time, part-time, or just starting out, you'll get insights into the tricks, tips, and production habits of writers from every level of the biz. From best-selling authors to those launching their first novels, you're sure to be in the company of friends as we encourage great writers to divulge and share their secrets. This is the Great Writers Share podcast with your host, best-selling author, Daniel Wilcox.
Hello and welcome to the Great Writers Share podcast with me, Daniel Wilcox, where every week I sit down with writers from across all mediums and genres to dissect their brains and pluck out tips, tricks and strategies that you can use to boost your writing career. Today's date is the 11th of November as I record. It won't be the 11th of November when this goes out, but do I have a treat for you guys today. So today's guest is the wonderful Humphrey Hawksley, who is a BBC foreign correspondent and author of thriller books and has been doing really, really well with his books over the past 30 years. He's a traditionally published author. And he's someone that hasn't been on my radar, someone that I was introduced to a few weeks ago, and I had to get on the podcast straight away. And we go into a lot of really, really interesting stuff in here. He's the first fully traditionally published author I've had on the show. And we dig into things like his research process. We talk a little bit about the state of traditional publishing now and how that's looked over the past 30 years and how that's changed. We talk about his approach to getting his books published, orphaning as an author. For anyone looking to go down that route, there's some interesting nuggets in there for you. And yeah, just kind of go on to that from there in terms of how we research, how we approach that, and get the books done and make them as realistic as possible. And it was a very, very interesting conversation. You'll see it all coming up, but we kind of go all over the place, and Humphrey was someone who was a delight to have on. So Humphrey, if you're listening, thanks again. But I won't tease the episode anymore before we actually go into the main segment. But what I will do before we jump into the main guest, as everyone expects by now, is to give a quick shout out to the Patreon page. So for anyone looking to get a little bit more out of the show, for as little as $1 a month, you can subscribe to the patreon.com/Great Writers Share page and join our host of patrons already over there, enjoying all the benefits. For as little as $1 a month, you can ask guests questions, you can get involved in our monthly giveaway. At the $5 tier, you can jump over into our Slack group and you can join in with a conversation there with other writers and see what's going on. And then we do have a $10 tier as well, which will include a load of live Q&As. And I am doing a bonus as announced last week. So for anyone who hasn't heard last week's episode yet, anyone who subscribes at the $1 level before the 31st of December will instantly get access to the $5 tier until June next year. So that's 6 months by just jumping on and pledging a quid, $1, whatever it is in your currency. But it's a bit of an extra end of the year bonus to build the community and just to give something back to you guys. This entire podcast is about providing value to you, about bringing on guests that can give you tips, tricks, strategies to help you in your writing career. And with that, anyone who joins at the $5 tier will also get access to the $10 tier and join in the monthly live Q&A. So there's a lot going on. Feel free to jump in, have a look. All you have to do is go over to www.patreon.com. That's patreon.com/Great Writers Share. And also just a quick shout out that this month's monthly giveaway is a copy of Cal Newport's Digital Minimalism. So if you fancy winning yourself a copy of that, all you have to do is become a subscriber, jump on over and get involved. And now, without any further ado, I'm going to pass you over into the interview with the wonderful, the delightful Humphrey Hawksley. Enjoy. Humphrey Hawksley is an author, commentator, and broadcaster who has reported on key trends, events, and conflicts from all over the world. His work as a BBC foreign correspondent has taken him to crisis on every continent. He was expelled from Sri Lanka, opened the BBC's television bureau in China, was arrested in Serbia, and initiated a global campaign against enslaved children in the chocolate industry, a campaign which continues till this day. Humphrey is the author of the acclaimed Future History series that explores world conflict. He has published 4 international thrillers, together with the non-fiction Democracy Kills, What's So Good About the Vote, a tie-in to his TV documentary on the pitfalls of the modern-day path to democracy from dictatorship. His work has appeared in The Guardian, The Times, Financial Times, International Herald Tribune, Yale Global, and other publications, and now he appears as a guest on the Great Writers Share podcast. Humphrey, welcome to the show.
Hello, Daniel. Good evening.
I'm so excited to have you. I really am. I mean, just the intro that I've just read is absolutely packed full of stuff that would be really, really interesting to dissect. And what I tend to do with my guests is I tend to try not to research too much, but to have a vague idea about what people are doing, because I don't want to ask questions people have asked before. I want to sort of drill and sort of follow any threads that might come out from the things that we speak about. But there is so much there that is really tempted to jump into that I'm just going to have to resist from, because by the looks of it, you've lived a very exciting life so far.
Well, it was. It sounds like the way you read it, it sounded incredible. Actually, it's basically the CV of a foreign correspondent, and I've been doing that now for 30 years odd, and you do get into these situations, and being storytellers, you sort of understand that yes, it is exciting, it is interesting, and you do have to think on your feet. And you meet the most incredible people. But also, in the world of books and films and that, you can make what we might think is the most mundane situation really interesting and gripping. So I was actually thinking when you were going through that, I thought, oh, who's this guy, that's been arrested in Serbia and thrown out of Sri Lanka and campaigned for on child slavery in the chocolate industry. And actually, that was my day job for many, many years. And being a journalist, you're either in a war situation, and the wars in those days, and they still are that sort of era, there's not necessarily a good guy or a bad guy. It's just two sets of people fighting each other, often what they call non-state actors. In other words, it's not necessarily governments. It's probably during a lot of the time I did it, these were two ethnic groups or religious groups didn't like each other. And that's what you do, and it becomes second nature to sort of get up in the middle of the night, go to the airport, do all that. And I do remember several times when you were doing that and looking out of the car window and seeing somebody standing by a bus stop that was going to an office and being a little envious that they were going in for a predictable day.
Yeah, it's that contrast, isn't it? I mean, you'll be, no matter what you're doing, there'll always be the opposite that you think, oh, that must be nice. And to see that person standing there have you ever had a job that's taken you to that place where you have had that routine, that very sort of regular rigmarole of what you're expected to do?
Well, also, yeah, I mean, it's essentially the same job. So if you're, I would go out to Iraq or Sri Lanka or something for a stint, and then you come back and you do, at the BBC, you had to come back and you did your time in the newsroom. Now, the newsroom was on a shift pattern. So you would turn up at, say, 9 o'clock, whenever the shift started, and work through till 6, and there would be a lunch break. And I was always very restless in that area. But people that were bringing up families and that had been out in these places and then came back, adjusted, and made that their lives. So it's just a matter, I think, of having that, mental bandwidth to handle both of the situations. And if with a big organization like the BBC, if you hadn't done your time at head office, it was very difficult to get the other jobs because you didn't know the people that would be appointing you to those jobs, or know the networks to make things, to do the sort of stories that you wanted to do.
And it obviously provided you with a wealth of actual experience to pump into your books, because like we read in the intro, you've got your sort of thriller series, you've got your sort of war impact series, your conflict series. Tell us a little bit about what that journey looked like from this exciting journalistic life into writing, because obviously there was something in there that brought you down to the keyboard and said, I want to write a book. So what did that journey look like for you? When did that start?
I don't think I've ever said this before, but I think that it was always there. I remember being at school with a torch under your parents had turned the lights out, of the torch under the sheets or whatever it was, reading adventure stories. And in those days, it was authors like Alistair MacLean that did Where Eagles Dare or The Guns of Navarone and that sort of thing. And then it moved on to to other ones, the Second World War thrillers and that sort of thing. And I thought, I really want to do this. if I could just write a book like this, I'd be a very happy person. Now, this is a kid that's 10 or 11 years old. So when you're 10 or 11, you don't know what on earth you want to do. And that, for some reason, and my, people that don't quite have that, there's something in, and you must have it too, Daniel. I mean, there's something, that this is what I want to do. And I think if you're a writer, you have that in you, and you say, this is what I want. So I think you still don't know even now. I became a journalist because I thought that would get me one step to being a thriller writer, essentially. And then, of course, the whole journalism thing encompassed me and embraced me and is completely compelling. And I kept thinking in the lull periods, well, maybe I should start writing that book, and you'd do a page of rubbish, and then the next story would go and you'd forget about it for a year or two. But the first time, it was when I was posted to Beijing by the BBC, and I thought I should write a book anyway. And I was doing a sort of non-fiction book about Wither China. And this was 20 years ago. So, where's China going? What is it? All the rest of it. So I wrote this really boring synopsis and sent it to an agent who I picked out of the yellow pages, which they had at that time. You didn't Google stuff then. and he got me a meeting with a publisher who's he's died now, but he was one of those old sort of veteran publishers. And we went into his office, and he looked at this piece of paper in front of him, which was my synopsis, and just sort of threw it to one side. He said, "This is all very interesting, but do you think you could write a book about America going to war with China?" And being a sort of hack news correspondent, of course I could. You do whatever the editor wants you to do. And I said, sure. He said, well, look, give me half a sheet of A4 paper on that, and let's see what happens. And that became my first book, called Dragon Strike, which was a huge success because it was published around the time that Hong Kong was being handed back to China in 1997. So there was a lot of spotlight on it. And it was done as what they called a future history. So it was written as if it was a factual account of something that had happened or was happening. And it wasn't really character-led. It was more sort of technical-led, operations-led. So this is how an aircraft carrier works. This is how policy is made in Downing Street. This is how the Situation Room operates in the White House and that sort of thing, as opposed to the sort of inner feelings of the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of Britain. And it was successful enough that I did 3 of them. And then it sort of petered out, or I think, yes, I did 3. Then the Iraq War kicked off, and I went sort of back to journalism, really.
Mm. How long did you have to wait until you got that meeting with the publisher?
Once it sort of got underway, it was really set for when I was in London, because I was living in Beijing. So I think that there was a lot of toing and froing about the really boring outline I had done. That sort of thin volume that lies at the bottom of a bookshop with a colon and an indescribable subtitle all over the place. But once the agent had seen had got it, I think he probably hatched something up with the publisher. And then when I came, as soon as the next trip to London, I got to see him. But then the process would have taken about, I think, 6 months to go through, because I had a co-author with it, actually, a Financial Times journalist called Simon Holberton. So we had to work out the plot, and then that got to him. And then, of course, the publisher has to sell it to the sales team and all that sort of stuff, and toing and froing. So I think the whole process between that meeting and the go to write it would have been about 3 to 4 months, maybe.
And what is it that you think he saw in you? Because obviously you had this proposal, this synopsis of one idea that you had, and from that there was obviously something there that made him think, okay, maybe not this, but we've got this other idea. Was it potentially the way the synopsis was written? Did he know much about your background? Do you think what were the factors that you think led him to taking that chance and putting that out there as your first book?
I would think that he saw I think that this particular publisher had done a book called The Third World War, as a matter of fact, which was the same title as one of my later books, which had been a huge success by a former British general, and because of the time I think he sort of wanted to repeat that in a way. I was quite well known at the time because I was on the BBC, so publishers always think that they can use that in their marketing of the book. So he had and then there was one of the things is the publishers look for is they know somebody who can write something. So he actually, I think we signed that contract on the half sheet of A4 paper that he wanted, but it was contingent on the publisher accepting the first chapter.
Okay.
And I haven't had a contract like that since then, actually. But I think he wanted to get it underway. He was a very experienced guy, and he said, "Well, let's do it. But if the first chapter is crap, then we'll tear that contract up and we won't do it." So I worked very hard on getting that first chapter as compelling as possible, and then the contract went through, or the book went through.
Fantastic. And what was your process when it came to actually writing that down and getting it sort of scripted? How did you go about planning the book? Was that, you said it was collaborative with another author as well and another journalist? Did you guys sort of bounce ideas off each other? That
was collaborative with another journalist, and I don't think I'd ever do it again. But you have a co-writer, don't you? So
I do. I have several.
Yeah, I have several co-writers. I mean, you know that process, but in this case, I think that I was taking the lead too much in it, and we didn't sort of. I don't think we gelled as a creative team very much, but we did get it done. But essentially, I think we sat down and with a huge wall chart and said, "Okay, how is this going to happen here? And then how does, if China attacks the South China Sea Islands, which are a little bit in the news now, so it goes and attacks these islands and it attacked Vietnam at the same time, who would react and what would they do and what would happen to the stock markets and how would Britain be involved?" And then it got into the sort of technicalities of what the warships could do. And I think one element that got a lot of sort of chat, two things actually in it that got chats. One was that China didn't have the sort of sophisticated military that the Americans had. It still doesn't. It's getting much closer. But what they did in our book is they had a diesel-electric submarine. And if you have a diesel-electric submarine and turn the engine off, it's run on batteries and is completely silent, and you can't actually find it. Of course, you can a bit, but you really can't. It's very difficult to find. And then we had them buying a whole lot of laptops off high street shops, and using the civilian software on that so it couldn't be tracked by the military. And this was something that I talked to a submariner and a couple of people. I said, supposing we did it this way. And they said, that might work. And I've often found that in research is that instead of going out with a sort of broad brush, try to find out or establish the story that you want to tell, and then throw out the really stupid suggestions to the experts and see which one sticks. If you do it the other way around, I've often found myself going down rabbit holes because it doesn't quite fit in with the plot and the story that you're trying to tell.
That's got to be something that's quite difficult, I guess, with a lot of your books. I mean, you're one word might not be the right word, but you're blessed to be surrounded by this career that has put you into all these situations where you see this conflict firsthand. You know a lot about the conflicts around the world, the history of how all that happened, which is something that I'm particularly envious in my books because I don't have any of that experience. So I have to hunt and go down the realms of Google and trying to interpret as much of that as possible. But how heavy do you go into the research phase, and what does that look like for you? Do you have sort of select people around you that you bounce off of a lot, or?
It's in fact, I'm doing one at the moment, and I'm asking myself this question, so I can bounce it off you, and then I can make my decision. So, I started a series, like the first one came out a year ago, called Man on Ice, which was a sort of adventure thriller based on the US-Russian border. And we've got one coming out now at the end of November called Man on Edge, which is based on the Russian-Norway border, both of which I had a lot of sort of research and background again. And now I'm doing another one, which I'm taking back to Alaska and then back to Europe again. And this time what I'm planning to do is sitting down and writing what I call the sort of first step outline draft, so pretty much the whole book, before going out to any of those places to see what the smells of the street are and the types of the people and all of that. And then to go out there in March-ish, when I've sort of done it, to those places and asking the precise questions and the precise locations to fit into the plot that I've written. It's a new way of doing it, because when I did Man on Ice, I actually went out to this desolate island that is with only 100 people on it, that's sort of 2 miles from Russia. And it took about 2 weeks out on that island and then doing the research and that gave me the idea for the book. But what it could have also done would have taken me down lots of different rabbit holes, which didn't quite fit in with the concept of the story I was going to tell. I don't know how you do it. I mean, how do you do it? You have your story, or you do your research and get your story from that, or
so I'm quite,
work?
Because a lot of some of my fiction can be qualified, I guess, as pulp. I tend to come up with my scenario, my characters, the sort of story I want to tell. I'll have the basis of what I want to hook it around and center it around. And then it'll usually be a case of, if one area of a character is quite dependent on something that I'm not entirely sure of. So, for example, I was working on a story at the beginning of this year about life on an oil rig. So I was doing a lot of digging into what that life looks like, specifically the people, like, are there certain roles, what's the hierarchy, all that kind of thing, to try and get an accurate representation of what that life would be like. Because with things like an oil rig, obviously, well, the entire story was going to be set on that rig, which means that I'd have to know it well to give it a good representation. And because that's something well out of my wheelhouse, it's something that I really have to make sure I'm familiar with, because I know quite a few people locally and sort of through the internet that have friends who work on oil rigs or have worked on oil rigs themselves. So with that was quite research heavy. But then with books which are sort of post-apocalyptic, because you're telling an alternative future in which most of the world has been decimated, and you don't really have to always anchor it around what the original event was. You can just go down the route of, here's a fresh slate, you can create and do pretty much whatever you want. So it kind of mixes between what projects I'm working on, really. And I guess it's also about, with fiction, there's always that amount of suspended disbelief, and you can have, it's whether you want to focus on making it sort of historically accurate or focus on that sort of fictional storyline. And I think it was, I listened to an interview with Lee Child where he was talking about one of his Jack Reacher books that he wrote. And he was talking about a chase scene that they did in New York and how he described every road, because he lived over there for years now. And he talks about the streets they were going down, the different turns, this and this. And because he got so bogged down in the actual fact of what that chase was, it then read clumsily, because readers didn't really care that, they turned left on this one and then went right and then went through this. They just want to know what that action is and keep that pace going. So I don't know, I guess there's not really a right way to it.
Will you be going out to an oil rig?
If I had the option, I would. I 100% would. I don't have that luxury at the minute, but that is something that, if I could, I definitely would go to one. At least to see what that experience is like, and particularly with things like that firsthand. And I guess with the places you're talking about, because they are very specific and unique in their own way, it is good to get that breath of air, that smell of the street from there.
I think because I had a sort of crisis of conscience. I don't know what it is. When I did Man on Edge, there's the Norway Russia thriller that's coming out in a couple of weeks' time. And I'd written most of it, but I wanted to have a sort of action dog sled ride through the snow across the Russian-Norway border.
You have my interest.
and I thought, well, I can do this. I can look at the YouTube videos and all that. Now, maybe I could have done. I honestly don't know, but I wouldn't have felt good about it. So I, much to the consternation of my family and everything, who couldn't understand it because I'd already been up there, I said, look, I've got to go back. I've got to get that. And we actually had a great day out with the dogs.
Amazing.
And the people to, because the border runs along sort of frozen water and it bounces all over the place. And I don't know whether the actual writing is better. But I do know that if somebody picks me up on it, say, an interview like with someone like you down the road, I can actually say, yes, I did smell the dogs and all the rest of the thing. And one of the things that isn't in there is that if you imagine a dog sled ride, which I didn't know, this is one thing I didn't know. You imagine you're sitting on this dog sled and you can see all the tourist brochure. There's 8 dogs we had in front of us, all busting to pull you along, and they're all held back. And then the anchors for them go, and they gallop off, and you sort of go off, and they've been sitting around for a long time, and you're facing their butts, and they are farting and doing all sorts of stuff. And you just have to, and nobody tells you that until it happens, and then of course it all quietens down.
I guess that's not the bit they put in the brochures.
No, that's not in the brochures, but it's all part and parcel of it. Yeah.
But do you think part of that then is also because of the type of fiction you write, there is an element of people look to those for some kind of historical or some factual content in there, and they, particularly with thrillers, they tend to go a bit more into the mechanics, into the realism. Like I say, whereas mine, the people that are reading my books, I know probably are less interested in that, and they prefer sort of the imaginative side, because I kind of often go into the paranormal and the things that aren't that realistic or true to life.
But you still have to create a whole world or situation that the reader believes and accepts. And then you have to take them on the story or journey through that situation. And you can't slip up on the way there, can you? Because they're going to be imagining that in their own sort of mind. And you have to keep that as accurate to the leap of faith that you've taken them on, which itself has got to be quite. I remember a New York agent told me, and I did a book about 10 years ago now called Security Breach, which I'd set a little bit in the future, but under a surveillance society where there are street cameras everywhere, which there are now anyway. So we're in that society. But he said, and there's something in it that he picked me up, and he said, Humphrey, he said, you can take your reader on one step with you, and they will trust you to take to that thing, but don't try to stretch that trust any further. Don't keep, there can be one thing that they know is not real and not the world they live in, and then keep them in that second world, as it were, that you've created. Does that sound like a familiar thing that you have to do?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say so. There's always the entire reader experience is about trust and being able to bring them along that journey. And I think it depends on what the expectations are of that reader, I guess, of what they know of you and the different books they've read of yours. Because that'll be the reason different readers gravitate to different authors is what experience they're trying to receive.
That's a very good point, isn't it? Yes, yes. That's
I know that go on.
No. Sorry. Well, I was thinking of the sort of conversation I had at the book launch about the psychological thriller, which took off, I guess, with Girl on a Train or Gone Girl, going on for 10 years ago now. And it was a genre that everybody wanted because it turned out that this was the drama going on in their own lives. And then I was at a conference last year where this topic came up again. And there's some publishers there said, well, we think it's going to change because now people don't want to know what's going on in their lives because the sort of psychological thriller, they don't want all this dreadful tension and drama, bloodiness and whatever, in your own life. They want to have a sort of existential adventure that they can follow that is separate from the murder when somebody's putting the rubbish out. And there was a sort of general discussion going that these sort of big niche, mass market niche things last about 10 years. So before The Girl on the Train, there was the Da Vinci Code, which sort of spurred all these religious thrillers that came out. About who is God, who is Jesus, what are the religions doing that, and then came the psychological thriller, and now everybody's scrabbling around looking for the next one.
Yeah, it's a change in pace of the world. I guess one thing that I have heard recently kind of follows a bit of that train of thought, in that because of and without getting into politics, this isn't necessarily a political show, although I have opinions with the situation in America at the minute.
Can we hear them?
No, maybe when I come on your podcast, you can launch one and I'll jump on. But obviously, with things like Brexit, with things like everything's happening in America and sort of all over the world, there's a certain amount of tension, and I know that I've had quite a few readers reach out, and they enjoy the escapism that my books tend to bring, because they lift us out of this reality that we are in, where everything is quite tense. So there tends to be, and again, it's particularly for my readers, maybe not necessarily other people's, but I get a lot of people messaging and saying that is specifically what they like about it, and they're looking for the next thing to take them out of this sort of tense world. It comes in pulses.
They want a dystopian world, but not the one that they're living in.
Yes. Something just that wouldn't happen, but could happen. It's a very strange way to look at it. But you've brought up a couple of times your Man on Ice book, which came out a couple of weeks ago, which is all very, very exciting. Can you tell us a little bit about that book, how you've approached getting that one? Because most of your books or all of your books have been through the traditional publishing route, haven't they? They've all been agents and picked up by houses.
Yes, correct. Yes, that's right. Yes.
So what was the journey with this book and its subsequent sequels?
That book originated from a foreign correspondent assignment I was on, and it came about around 2015, during the Ukraine crisis, when Russia was sort of rearing up again as the sort of ugly force. And I wanted to go somewhere that everybody else wasn't going, but to be able to sort of look at that story. And that was, I opened a map. I sort of love looking at maps when I've got my mind on these things, and saw that the Russian and America actually share a border, which, you sort of know, but you don't really know. And it's it goes through the Arctic, but there's a particular place just under the Arctic Circle where there are two islands. One is called Big Diomede, and that's a Russian military base. And then 2 miles across the water is a smaller island called Little Diomede, which got a village of about 80 Eskimos on it that I was mentioning. And I thought, well, I've got to go there. It's a no-brainer for me, because I like wild places, remote places, impossible to get to places. So we went there, and it was all of those things. And I was meant to stay about 36 hours and ended up staying more than a week, because fog was there and the helicopter can't come in on the fog, and there's no ferry, there's no boats, there's no cars, there's nothing. And there's just a sort of Eskimo community of stilted grey houses more like sort of little cabins where there wasn't a school. And then across the water, every morning you get up, you see Russia. And through binoculars, you can see the Russian military guard posts and occasionally helicopters coming around. They've got a helicopter base just out of sight. And I did a report for the BBC and everything, but I thought, well, what would happen if Russia decided to take this island? Because there was no troops on it. There's no customs posts. There's no government at all. And actually, there's no flags on the border. There's no marker for the border, no buoys, nothing. And you can't go across. It's a closed border, essentially. And I thought, okay, so supposing the Russians come in and take this island, what would the Americans do? And I asked a number of people in the defense, intelligence, military communities, and it was quite a funny answer, actually. Half of them said, well, we just let them have it. The other half said, no way, we'd start the Third World War. But then I needed a ticking clock, as you do in a thriller. So I thought, well, supposing they take it, on the eve of a presidential inauguration that always takes place midwinter on the 20th of January at noon. So you actually have a time when one president is handed over to another president. And if you think of the Barack Obama, Donald Trump handover, you can have two guys that don't really get on, have completely different views, and would do different things the minute they get into power. So I built all that up and wrote it and sent it to the agent, who I think said rewrite it, which most, because being a journalist, you write stuff very quickly and you just want to get it out and then move on to the next one, which is something I'm still learning as a writer. And then I did. I rewrote it and made it into a proper comprehensive thing, and then we sold it, and that came out last year, 2018, and the paperback has just come out. And I discussed with the publishers, so we're now making a series on it. So the hero of that series comes from this island. So he's an Eskimo without any parents, sort of a rugged guy that joins the Alaska National Guard, which is the sort of local military. But because he's so good, he gets seconded to Iraq and Afghanistan as a special forces guy, and happens to be visiting the island when the Russians come in with his fiancée, who's a trauma surgeon from Brooklyn in New York. So there's all these sort of emotional relationship, culture clashes going on together with the political stuff. And I, I also thought how to do it. You never know if you get it right. It's a bit like sort of playing a sport, isn't it? You can never get it 100% right. So how much of it is the action? How much of it is the character, personal relationships? How much is the politics? How much is your reader interested in how decisions are made in the White House and the tension there? Or do they just want the hard weaponry and the guy going across the ice to and all the obstacles that he's met to fix the situation? And basically, I think you wing it, but it did well. And we did another one that's coming out in a couple of weeks' time at the end of November called Man on Edge, which is one I was talking about, where you have the same set of characters, but this time it's the Russia-Norway border and the kind of spy thing, smuggling out secrets across the border, which you have to do in hard sort of disk form, because if you send anything electronically, a lot of information electronically now, it will be picked up. So you're sort of going backwards in a way that you have to carry something across a border, because if you try to, there's no encryption and that sort of thing that would be able to get a huge amount of information there without it being detected. So we're doing that one. So then I'm doing another one now, which I think would be called Man on Something, whereby I'm going to go back to that island in Alaska, because that's where the hero comes from. I'm just trying to decide and brace myself, as we were discussing before, a bit like you going to an oil rig. Do I, how do I get there? Do I really need this for my book? And I think that I think at the end of the day, if you, I'm just trying to think, an Inspector Morse series or Midsummer's Murders, or that stuff that we know that's set in a sort of English village, that whodunit, you'd want the author to know the village, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
So you said in an oil rig, which who the hell can get to an oil rig easily, or I set mine on this island, the reader is still going to expect the same service from the author and authenticity from the author. So actually, as I'm saying that, I know I'm persuading myself to do something that I know is completely crazy to do, but I'm going to do it anyway. So thank you for the conversation.
You're very welcome. I'm happy to help. And it was actually, it was part of the reason that I said I was working on the book earlier this year, and I've actually since put it on hold because I didn't feel I was giving that authentic experience. And I need to look at how I approach that, because particular story I want to tell without.
Why can't you pop out to an oil rig?
Need to find one. I need to ask around and basically see how to make that possible. See what's nearby.
You could go up to Aberdeen and hitch a ride on a helicopter.
Yeah, I mean, there are circumstances that are a bit hard to get past, but I can keep pushing it. It's definitely a story I want to tell. But with so you've got book number 1 out, you've got book number 2 soon, you've got book 3 coming out next year. One question that I did want to ask, because so far on this show you are guest 17, and out of my 16 other guests, I think I'd say about 90% of those have been independently published authors, and I've had a few hybrid authors who have had sort of independent and traditional publishing deals. And the story I'm getting from a lot of people who aren't necessarily within the traditional publishing industry is that there's a lot of, I guess, tension in how the independent publishing is forcing it to change how it deals with stuff. And I just wondered whether, as a person who has been traditionally published for a number of years, whether you've seen any kind of significant changes in the process of how you've had to apply to get books, or how you've been dealt by publishers from sort of the beginning to now. Is there anything that sort of changed massively for you that you've picked up on at all?
Well, I think the technology has changed. So when I first started in the Dragon Strike that we discussed earlier, there was no ebook, there was no digital element, and the self-publishing were sort of people getting stuff in their backyards. And then, of course, there was what they called vanity publishing then. But now I think that I think the publisher companies themselves have been very slow and behind the curve on what's been happening. It certainly was about 10 years ago. So they were very behind the curve on the ebook thing, the self-publishing ebook elements of it. And this was partly a generational thing, because the guys that had sort of been handling the bestseller writers, the John le Carrés of this world, and the Dan Browns and that, they were still around, but they were, they're getting into their sort of 50s and whatever. But they weren't going to have that sort of new input of generational change. The younger people that came in were finding it's very difficult to sort of change the whole publishing model around. I think that the actual process which I'm going through at the moment with this series is that, as an author, even a sort of author with a publishing house author, is that you have to do the marketing yourself.
I was going to ask.
And you might, if you can afford to, have to put your own skin in the game for it. So you mentioned Lee Child, James Patterson, Peter James. These people have all put substantive amounts of their own money into getting their books out there, and they can afford it. So, the struggling artist in the garret type of thing, is not. But when I go to the Author Society meetings or the thriller, these conferences, I actually get quite depressed, because 90% of them are people that aren't quite where they imagined they would be. So therefore, there's always someone to blame. The books weren't in the shops, or this went wrong, or that went wrong, and everything. But I think I rather approach it in a way that what is going to go wrong will go wrong. So I've been orphaned, I think, more times than I can imagine. So just to give you a sort of example, the book that I mentioned that I wrote a little bit into the future, called Security Breach, which I think came out about 10 years ago. I was paid a lot of money for that book by an American publisher that was then called Warner Books. And I was covering Iraq at the same time as well, so I wasn't keeping a close enough eye. The contract was signed and all the rest of it. But I wasn't getting the sort of edits and changes back from the editor. I said to the agent, what's happening? And he checked. So the guy that had bought it had been fired. And nobody really wanted the book, it turned out, or nobody had read it apart from him. So then there was another younger editor who was very nice that I worked with for a couple of weeks, and then she left for another company. And then I was put onto a sort of veteran editor who wasn't going anywhere because he was 2 years from retirement. But then the whole company got taken over. And the marketing budget, now publisher will never reveal the marketing budget when they sign the contract. The more the money that is paid, the more likely they are to put money into marketing. But that, as far as I know, is never part of the deal. So the marketing budget that had been allocated to this book and a number of other books was completely stripped away and given to the books that were favored by the new executives that had come in with the company takeover. So therefore you get these situations. Now, we were talking earlier on about, was it Gone Girl or Girl on the Train? One of those two, which I think was published here by Transworld or something like that, one of those companies. Anyway, they had 4 of those books. So imagine 4 similar books to Girl on a Train, all pretty much the same, all about to be published by this same publishing company, which I can remember now, but I won't mention it just in case somebody says, well, that wasn't me. And the editors in that company did not know which one was the best. So they put it out to a focus group, and the focus group came back, and the focus group was very divided, but they decided that Gone Girl was the one that really was the one that would, hit all the right buttons. The marketing budgets were stripped away from the other 3 and all put into Gone Girl, which became a huge success. But those other 3 books were probably just as good. But it didn't have that muscle of money and sales teams around it. And I don't know what those 3 books were and who those authors were. Maybe they picked themselves up and done something else. Maybe they've gone off to do another thing. So I think what I'm saying on this thing is that the whole element of getting published by a mainstream publisher, it's probably as much as a crapshoot as it is getting independently published. And I have the rights back to 3 or 4 of my books that are up there. And I don't do any of this BookBub stuff with them. I just put them, they're up on Amazon. But I can see how much they sell every day. And the ones that are selling are the ones that we talked about earlier, the Dragon Strike, Third World War, and Dragon Fire, are selling every day from somewhere in the world. The other commercial fillers, including the Security Breach one, barely sells a copy. But I suspect, and this is why I've sort of veered away from independent publishing, because I can see that you can do a lot of stuff, a lot of work on it. Maybe you can shed some light on this, and then your sales will be very, very low. And you actually don't have any sort of backup or anything to do. It's just you every day trying to sort of find a different way to sell that book. Am I right? Or
I mean, there are lots of different approaches and strategies to doing that. I think if people are approaching it in that way, where they have a book and they're trying to peddle the same book or the same sort of handful of books without bringing out new material, I think people independently struggle. It tends to be a game where you have to be constantly producing, you have to be bringing out new work pretty regularly in order to keep fans engaged and to keep Amazon feeding people into your system.
Okay.
It's a difficult one. I think
regularly, you mean every couple of months or every 6 months, or?
So I mean, I'm working with people at the minute who tend to put out books sort of once a month at least.
Okay.
Just to feed that. And there's sort of all kinds of jargon, sort of like the 28-day cliff, where your books will naturally, depending on what you do to start with, but they'll sell, and then you sort of get to 28 days, and then it will start to sort of drop off because Amazon algorithms have decided that that's as far as they'll push them for. I mean, I'm being very sort of layman's with this, but
that's interesting. Yeah.
There's a lot of work to do as an independent. It's a very different strategy to traditional publishing from what I understand anyway. But it depends, I guess, what kind of stuff you want to approach as a writer.
Yeah, I guess so. I'm carrying out an experiment along the sort of Peter James Lee Child thing, in that I've got a social media company that's creating videos.
Yeah.
And social tiles, you'll be familiar with this thing, and along a raft of platforms that, and this word content keeps coming out to me.
Yes,
We've got to
content marketing.
Content, everyday content. So he keeps pushing. He's very good. He keeps saying, look, we need more quotes from your book. We need another video. We need to get the people in. And I've seen it. It's, every day there's more engagements and more shares and more this sort of thing and that sort of thing. This is being done, in cooperation with the publisher, but it's a totally separate sort of entity to it. I mean, they're feeding stuff into it, but it's my operation really to see whether it's going to work or not. At the moment, touch wood, it seems to be going in the right direction.
Yeah, there's a lot of because my former full-time job was as a marketing manager, and there's a lot of stuff about the social media world, about having to constantly keep reminding people that you're there, about just basically bashing people with content, because depending on how granular you get with it, most people will want to at least see something fresh from you, a minimum of once a day, sort of at the barest of minimums, if you're going to sort of hyper succeed. And it depends again what your outputs want to be, what your ultimate goals are. But I mean, social media and content marketing is a whole different ballgame. But we are unfortunately coming up on time a little bit, and I've got a couple more questions from patrons I want to ask you.
Off you go.
But it might mean that I'll have to drag you back at some point, because this is very, very interesting. Okay, so these questions are from my patrons over at patreon.com/greatwritersshare. I think I mentioned it in the intro all about that, so I'm not going to remind people now. But this question is from Mark M, who says, how much research did you have to do for the Future History series? And do you have any tips on how you would do it differently with the benefit of hindsight?
A lot of research for those things, working through military people, intelligence people, and that kind of thing. I don't think I would do it any differently, actually. I might reread the books and say, well, I should have gone in that direction or this direction. But for the style of books and the type of readership, I think, of course, a lot of it now, I'd probably be talking to less people, because as the internet, I think the last one of those came out in 2003 or 2004. So the internet is far better now, and I would sit and do what we're doing now, sort of on Zoom or Skype, and talk to people instead of flying into Delhi or Mumbai and going up to military camps. But as far as the sort of general sort of ethos and the way I was doing it, I think I'd keep it pretty much the same.
Nice. John Cronshaw asks, and he is a former journalist himself, what challenges did you find in writing fiction compared to reportage, and what makes a good dragon?
In reporting, you write it, press a button, and it goes. And I thought when I was doing my first book, well, that's it's 80,000 words, so that's 80 feature articles or something like that. No way. The strands and the structures that have to run all the way through the book is something that continues to flummox me. And I have the impatience of a journalist. I don't think I have the patience of a sort of, long-term writer. So I'm constantly fighting that thing. So that was a question that I can tell was given with great insight. It's tricky. The research in that is great from the reporting, but the structuring of particularly fiction with character-driven subplots, atmosphere, and that sort of thing, you really have to say, right, I'm not a journalist anymore, I'm a writer. And that is a whole different trade.
Fantastic. And that's a question from patrons. So now we will jump into our quick fire round, which, as forewarned before I hit record, is 10 quick questions. I'm going to throw at you as quickly as possible. Answer them as best you can. If you do get stumped, feel free to say pass. I'll just delete half the interview. But we'll roll. If you're happy to get going, I can throw some questions at you now.
Are these general knowledge questions, or?
These are just random questions.
Right, off you go then.
You should be able to answer them. They're fine. Okay. Helicopters or planes?
Helicopters.
Who's the one person you'd most like to meet?
Oh, Mick Jagger.
What one thing goes with you everywhere you travel?
A little pebble from the island of Barra, hand-painted pebble from Barra that I got back in the 80s. It's just kind of good luck charm.
What's the most memorable place you visited?
I think Little Diomede, the island in the book, in Man on Ice. It's just so wild and remote and completely crazy.
What book are you currently reading?
I'm looking at it now. Oh no, that's the Royal United Services Institute Journal. So that's not a very good one, is it? And I have with me Alan First, The Spies of Warsaw.
Nice. What one book would you recommend to a friend?
Candide. Voltaire, Candide.
What's your favourite animal?
Dog.
What one food can't you stand?
Pineapple.
Is there a single quote which you live your life by?
Failure is not an option, although that's a bit of a cliche, but it's a good one, isn't it?
I love it. Clichés for a reason. And what impact would you like to have on the world?
None. It's too many people trying to find relevance.
Perfect. That's 10 questions.
Okay, good
Nice.
Questions.
Thank you. Did you feel the pressure? I mean, you've obviously been in more pressured situations, and some guy sat in his living room asking you 10 questions, but it tends to get writers really sort of their heart racing.
Well, it does a bit, because you think, this is my legacy. People are going to laugh at me about this the rest of my life.
I do have one more question, which is, where can our listeners find out more about everything that you do and all that you're working on?
If they Google Humphrey Hawksley, that's Hawksley, my website comes up, and then all the books and everything's on there. If they don't want to do too many taps, there's www.manonice.co.uk, and that'll go straight through to the latest series.
Perfect. Well, Humphrey Hawksley, thank you very much for coming on the Great Writer Share podcast. It's been a pleasure.
It's been mind-stretching. Thank you.
Mind stretching. I love it. Awesome. And thank you everyone for listening, and I will see you next week. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Great Writer Share podcast. Next week, I'll be talking to house sitter, traveller and globe-hopping author Kelly Hayes-Raitt. And don't forget, you can get early access to every episode of the Great Writer Share podcast and the chance to ask upcoming guests any of your questions just by becoming a patron of the show. All you need to do is visit www.patreon.com/Great Writers Share and support the show for as little as $1 a month. One more time, that's www.patreon.com/Great Writers Share. Until next time.